Hello and welcome along to the Unplugged Pod, where each week we explore everything and anything to do with the wonderful world of switching off in a world that's always on. I'm David, a journalist, and as ever, I'm alongside Hector Hughes, Mr. Unplugged.
And this week we've got on Jamie Clements. Jamie is a master breathwork facilitator, running the breath space, and also the founder of Man Down podcast. He's a super thoughtful guy, and we're very much looking forward to this conversation. Let's go.
Jamie, well, first of all, thanks so much for coming on the pod, mate. Very much appreciate it. I know as you're a man who's kind of centered a lot of your work around breath work, I hope you appreciate the oxygen coming out from all my massive plants. Artificial or otherwise, I'll say. I'll let you guess in your own time. But yeah.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, my flat is similarly plant heavy, mostly artificial. So I can barely look after myself, let alone a plant. So it's great to be here.
The idea of oxygen is probably enough sometimes.
Exactly.
So Jamie, what do you do to unplug?
What do I do to unplug? I was thinking about this on the way over here. I think that there's an obvious answer, and then there may be a slightly more interesting answer. I think I am obviously a huge advocate of breath work and stillness, meditation, and everything. It's centered in that sphere, and that really is my go-to day-to-day, moment-to-moment. Like whatever chances I get, I'll always make time for some calm, some quiet, some deep breathing, some slow breathing, just to check out of what is, we're in London now, it's a frantic pace, it's a stressful environment, it's a hectic environment. And so just trying to rebalance that and give myself a time to unplug and to check out of that a little bit. A less on brand answer, I think, would probably be listening to music and playing video games. That is the other side of my unplugging, which is just, I have a very busy brain. I'm a calm person, but I have a very busy brain anyway. I think that's just how I'm wired. And for me, I love a gentle distraction where my brain just comes away from 1,000 thoughts a minute and comes a little bit into something a little bit more, a little bit less serious, a little bit more light. So that's kind of the other side of it. And then the one that I wish I had more time for is surfing. I think that's probably number one. If I could surf every day, that would be my main unplug.
I really like the video games answer, because they get such a bad rep these days. I think so many negative connotations towards video games and like falling into some kind of young man incel community and that kind of thing. But combine that with the pan au chocolat you just mentioned, exactly. And I rate it's a nice full picture. But it's funny, surfing is an amazing example, because I've tried it a few times, and I think even whether you're a complete expert or total beginner, it is one of those things that fully takes you out of yourself. It's the same with so many things in nature in general, right? But surfing's a massive one, because you're just continually humbled by what's around you, and there really can only be one thing on your mind.
Absolutely. I think that I always say to people, I love surfing. They're like, oh, you must be good. I'm not good. I am not good at surfing. I would say I'm an advanced beginner. Like I can stand up on sort of small to medium waves and get humbled on a regular basis. And I love every minute of it. It's frustrating, it's painful, it's liberating, but that's it. It's that like flow state, completely out of your own head. And that for me, I think, comes from a place of, it's like that. There's a great Venn diagram that's like discipline and surrender, and that gap in between is flow, because you are completely separated from anything that's going on around you, but you have to be so dialed in, because the sea can just wipe you out and ultimately kill you if you're not careful. And so you have to be really, really laser focused, but also really, really relaxed. And so it's sort of in that beautiful intersection of the two, where you're terrified but liberated in the same way.
I was going to say, this is the part where, Hector, you normally say, have you read Flow by Csikszentmihalyi? Have you read it? Yeah, it's good. But I love the idea of flow, because, I mean, you could talk a lot, I think, about the validity of it and where it stands scientifically, right? But a lot of people can point towards something that completely does take them out of it, and it doesn't have to be something super profound. I remember, this is honest, like one of the moments in my life where I felt most in flow ever was I used to work at ITN, right? Mm-hmm. And it was we worked on a lot on sport, and there was a foosball table football table in the office, right? And over the course that I worked there for years and years, we had like a big team. And over the course of a few years, we got good, and then we didn't just get good. We started to get really, really good because we were playing for maybe like an hour a day, right? For 5 years.
Yeah.
And towards the end, it suddenly dawned on me that when I was playing, there was absolutely nothing else in my mind, past or present, and I was genuinely like in a point of flow. And I said this to a couple of people, expecting like a bit of a backlash or someone to take the piss, and they were like, no, that 100%. It was euphoric. It was crazy, and that's stupid. Like, not stupid, but it's something trivial.
Yeah, it feels trivial, right? But I think so often, as we get older and as we get a little bit more serious and a little bit more fatigued and a little bit more mature, we lose touch with seemingly trivial but ultimately playful aspects of our lives as well. And I think all of these things, or a lot of the things that bring people back to flow, are often in the realm of play as well. There's always a playful element because it's either you're learning something new or you're dialing back into that slight inner child, and inner child stuff gets a little bit cliche at times as well, but that inner child, that those parts of ourselves, we get very restricted. I was thinking about this on the tube looking at everybody commuting, and just how the stress of life, getting all the responsibilities, just like gradually just boxes us in and restricts us. And I see it a lot in people that I work with in their breath. You get more restricted breathing, you get a little bit tighter, you get a little bit shallower, and that perpetuates the cycle. And actually all of these things, flow, play, are loosening the shackles and almost re-expanding us from what is quite a narrowed, clamped down, restricted way of living.
And it's also, I feel like play doesn't get as much airtime as a lot of the other kind of well-being areas, right? Like, everyone needs to try meditation or whatever. Is obviously a big proponent of that. But sometimes it is just playing a silly game, And often it's like going back to what you really enjoyed as a child. Some people love painting, some people love card games, whatever it is. But there's something about rediscovering that just completely takes you out of yourself.
I think there's like a sneaky hidden agenda in a lot of personal development, which is, we're all trying to be happier, healthier, more fulfilled. But the undercurrent is be more productive. Yeah. It's like meditate so your head is clearer, so you're more productive. Meditate so you're better at focusing, so you're more productive. Regulate your nervous system so you're more creative and more productive. Like it can be, unless you can check it and get it in check, just funneling us back towards get more stuff done, make more of your time and all of that, which I think is something that I've had to be super aware of, because I think even in the realm that I operate in the world that I work in, it's so easy just to almost, fall back into patterns and trappings that I fell into in full-time employment, and some of the reasons I actually left full-time employment. And I think that is an interesting journey that I see people go on in self-development as well. It's like, okay, I'm healing, I'm trying to feel better in myself, I'm trying to accept myself, and then quickly I'm back on the treadmill trying to achieve and hit goals and everything else. And so I think we just need to be careful and mindful of sort of the arena that we're playing in doesn't necessarily change. And so actually, how do we adapt to that, and how do we fit into that as we try and progress and as we try and, become better in ourselves?
I think there's also just accepting that, or just understanding that it is cyclical as well, because I've definitely gone through points of feeling like I've cracked it and I've figured it out, and then life comes along and knocks you down a few pegs, and that can be really demoralizing. You think like, why isn't it working anymore? But it's just understanding that. There's a great book called Windsor. I'll stop referencing books soon, but
I'll start in a second. That's fine.
Which is about this. It's about kind of going through grief and suffering and going through a literal winter, but also about how we have these winters in our lives. And actually, in winter, it's better not to fight it. It's better to kind of curl up with a good book and a blanket, etc., and really just lean into it. And I think a lot of the time, especially in the kind of busy lives we live in London, you can really be like fighting life, and fighting the stresses and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes it is better to retreat.
Absolutely. Yeah, I always question these things when I see them on social media, but I saw something to do with autumn and trees and how actually they're at their strongest and their roots are at their strongest during autumn and winter, when actually from the outside looking in, they look their weakest because they're resourcing and they're grounding and they're getting all of this nutrients ready for the spring. And it was just like, okay, like actually when you winter, when you go inwards, that's where you can do some of your best work, because you're like, okay, this is where the hard stuff is. This is where I'll learn about myself. We can all, it's easy to live a nice life when everything's ticking along. And then, as you said, life happens. And it's like, okay, how I think a lot of this self-development stuff is what, and I see this in myself very often. It's like you can learn to talk the talk and continue to talk the talk, and it all is a little bit almost at times theoretical and hypothetical. I'm like, I know how I would deal with that when it comes up because I know myself a little bit better and I understand the book that I read. And then it actually shows up in reality, and all of a sudden you're like, oh God, like I know the theory, but I'm not putting it into practice. And I think that's where we have to, again, be mindful of reading the books, listening to the podcasts, going over and over the same material, because you've just got to live life and you've actually got to put stuff into practice. And I think we can often start lamenting ourselves a little bit when we have the knowledge and it's not being put into practice as well. We sort of have this middle ground where it's like, oh, I should be doing this better, but why am I not, even with this new knowledge? So I think, yeah, we need to enjoy the winters and sort of embrace those moments of hardship, but also just of like learning and growth.
Yeah, I always think it's interesting. Ryan Holiday talks about there's no point reading like Stoic philosophy unless you're going to put it into practice, right? It's there to be used. It's not about reading and finishing a book on Stoicism. It's about like going through a difficult day, week, month, and reading about it and making it all actionable. Because I do think that, especially like the wellness and optimization world, you can get lost in so many rabbit holes, and it kind of becomes this bizarre caricature of itself. Sometimes we spend your whole day optimizing rather than actually being productive. Just to scroll back slightly then, Jamie, why don't you kind of tell everyone what you do and how your work's centered around breath work and how you found yourself in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I founded my business, The Breath Space, coming up to 4 years ago. And all of the work that I do is centered around breath work and the nervous system and the subconscious mind. And really, as it's developed, working with a really broad range of people. So I work privately, I work with groups, I run retreats, I work with athletes, I work with businesses, kind of anyone and everyone really. The reason for that being, people go, oh, it's a nice niche, you know, I work with everybody. And I go, yeah, in a way.
Everyone's got to breathe. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's it, kind of slightly jokingly, you know, it is just breathing. And I think that's the beauty of why I love my work so much, is because it can, to some extent, support everyone in some capacity. And so the way in which I work is really across 3 main pillars. So I look very much at functional breathing, which is respiratory physiology and respiratory health, and looking at, okay, how can we breathe better just to feel better on a day-to-day basis? And then we start looking at the nervous system regulation, and then some of the more therapeutic, healing-informed modalities of breath work, like conscious connected breathing. And across those, the real message is about optimizing, come back to that word, optimizing your performance and your overall well-being through your nervous system and your subconscious mind. And really, the more I dive into this work, the more I'm erring towards the basics and actually looking at breath work and these other practices that we can use to support ourselves as a bit of an antidote to modern living, and going, okay, modern life isn't getting any slower, so how can we amp up this side, the rest, the recovery, the stillness, the self-awareness, to rebalance the scales? Because I think I see it in myself, you know, to tell someone who is ambitious and driven, living in a city, wanting to grow, wanting to better themselves, wanting to be successful, I don't want to start saying to those people, well, if you want to feel better, you just got to stop all of that, because they don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear that. And so how can we help those people, but also everybody, rebalance the scales, take stock of where they're at, understand themselves better? And the beauty of breathwork for me, and the way in which I like to work, is to empower people to understand and sort of employ tools and techniques to support themselves, so that when I'm not there, they know what they're doing. So yeah, that's sort of where it's come from and how it's developed over the last few years. I also do other things which I often forget about. So I'm part of a team that runs a studio over in Fulham. It's a movement space, and then also a recovery space, which is heat, ice, and sauna. Sauna, ice, and breathwork downstairs, which is a really amazing community. And then I'm also a podcaster as well. So I met Hector through my podcast many years ago. Had a podcast focused around men's mental and emotional health. That's still on Spotify, but I haven't recorded for 2 years. And that's pretty much parked now, but I'm working on a new podcast at the moment with a friend of mine, again on same sort of topic around men's health and mental and emotional health as well.
When you say breath work, I guess everyone has a different understanding of that based on how much they know or how much they care about their breathing, right? So it's just on the most fundamental level for someone that doesn't have that much time to be reading, books on breath work or this kind of thing. How do you define breath work and why is it necessary?
So umbrella term, any way we can use our breath to shift our state physically, mentally, or emotionally. So that's the one-liner. The unfortunate thing, and sometimes the fortunate thing about that, is that it's very broad and very vague. And so what I would say to someone completely new who's going, what on earth are we talking about? How can you breathe more healthily day to day, moment to moment? You take 20,000+ breaths every single day. How can you make sure you're doing that in the best possible way to support your health? Nervous system work, so simple breathing techniques, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes to shift your state, to change how you feel. Could be reducing stress, could be increasing energy, just working with the nervous system by changing how you breathe. And then there's a sort of third realm of breath work, which is what I work with, conscious connected breath work, which is it can create altered states of consciousness, transcendent experiences, hypnotic, trance-like states where we can access our subconscious mind. So those are all quite different, which is why I think it's important to break it down. But broadly speaking, any way that we can work with our breath to shift our state.
And just on that day to day, I guess, obviously a lot of people, breathwork seems to be absolutely booming in popularity for good reason, but a lot of people won't have got there yet. And for someone who hasn't explored this space, what is happening during the day to your breath when you're going through stress at work? Like what are people doing now?
So we've essentially got this ongoing cycle between our breath and our nervous system. So the state of your nervous system will change your breath. The state of your breath will change your nervous system. And every emotion, every experience is tied to your nervous system and tied to your breath. So the simplest way to think about this is that if you're stressed, if you're afraid, if you're anxious, your breathing will shift typically to potentially in and out of the mouth instead of in and out of the nose, but it will shift up into your chest. So it'll be shorter, shallower, and faster. Now, when it comes to our natural breath, it's a bit of a virtuous or a vicious cycle, depending on what's going on. So it doesn't really matter whether it starts in your nervous system or starts with your breath. A short, shallow, fast breath will create a stress response in your nervous system, and a stress response in your nervous system will create that form of breath. So it sort of perpetuates. And that's why I think we're seeing more and more focus on it, because we go, okay, well, if that cycle is continuously going on, I should probably do something about it. And one of the simplest and easiest ways into that cycle is through the breath. And so really the unique thing about the breath is, and this is where we get a little bit into the science and the weeds of it, but it's part of something called the autonomic nervous system, which is part of our nervous system that broadly speaking has two branches. It has our sympathetic response, which is our stress response, and our parasympathetic response, which is our rest and digest response. Through the breath, we can shift between those two branches. So the autonomic nervous system governs all of our automatic functioning in the body. So saliva production, heart rate, digestion, pupil dilation, and our breath, and a few others. The breath is the only part of that system that we can consciously change. And so through changing that, we can shift every other function within that nervous system and shift either into stress, which there could be good reasons for, or out of stress. And so we can almost use it like an accelerator or a brake pedal for the nervous system to create change. So that's really the underlying mechanism. And for a lot of people who are experiencing high stress, we think about people who find themselves feeling very stressed or very anxious, there's typically an associated breathing pattern with that. And so if you are not paying any attention to how you're breathing, and you just, even when you're not stressed, you're breathing short, shallow, fast, you're going to be creating stress. And so it's just perpetuating this cycle. And so we need to find a way to interrupt that, to change that, and to shift that. And the starting point for that is just bringing awareness to the breath, and then starting to change things once we understand that.
And what does that process look like? So I guess it's kind of like what we were saying about meditation earlier, which is it's easy when you're sitting in the studio with the Zen music in the background, but it's tough when you're standing up there in front of all the people about to give the talk. So what have you found really works, I guess, with people you work with, and how do you see that progressing?
Yeah, I think I always say, as you've alluded to there, the real gold in this work is your ability to apply it in situations that are uncomfortable, that are stressful. You can sit at home and breathe nice and slowly and deeply and sort of be at peace.
Yeah, which is also great.
Really great. Yeah,
sure.
Wonderful part of this, because actually I always say and this probably more directly answers your question, almost a two-pronged approach. So if you're operating day to day, kind of ticking at quite a high level of stress, then we need to take both a proactive and a reactive approach. The proactive would be 10 minutes in the morning, 10 minutes in the evening, regardless of how you feel, slowing the breath down, working with maybe an extended exhale breath where we make simply the exhale longer than the inhale. Could be 3 seconds in, 6 seconds out, gradually making that longer and slower. Typically, we want to focus on breathing through the nose, particularly on the inhale. So it could be in through the nose, out of the nose, in through the nose, out of the mouth. Popular exercises that seem to be getting more and more awareness, like box breathing, which is inhale, hold, exhale, hold, usually starting with a 4-second count per part. And that proactive element is about, if you're operating from that high level of stress, naturally bringing your nervous system back down overall from maybe a 7 out of 10 to a 5 out of 10, where you're a little bit more balanced and a little bit less reactive. So that would be a foundational piece to say, okay, if you're, I work unsurprisingly with a lot of people who struggle with chronic stress, anxiety, burnout. That's always where we start. It's like, okay, daily practice, consistent practice, which we can come on to as to why people struggle with that. And then the reactive part would be in the moment. Okay, I'm about to go out on stage and speak. I'm about to go into a meeting. I'm having an uncomfortable conversation with a friend or a partner or whatever it might be. And your heart rate naturally starts to spike. Your nervous system naturally starts to elevate. Similar techniques in the moment. We want to actually interrupt that stress response and bring us back down again. And I think there's a lot of well-intentioned advice on social media in general, but particularly around breath work, where they say, if you're having a panic attack, just breathe in for 10 seconds and out for 10 seconds. And as someone who's had plenty of panic attacks in my life, that's well-intentioned but very unhelpful, because you can't breathe for that tempo when you're in high stress and high panic. And so something, if anyone does experience panic attacks that's listening, something like ratio breathing, where it's just a balanced inhale to exhale ratio, but you start with 2 seconds in, 2 seconds out, 3 seconds in, 3 seconds out, and you gradually slow the breath down. And that, I guess those two sides to me really illustrate the power of breath work, because a conversation that often comes up and a question I'm often asked is, breath work or meditation, what's better? What should I be doing? I think they're pretty distinct. I actually think there's a big chunk in the middle of crossover, but I actually think there's quite distinct reasons why I would suggest one or the other. For me, breath work is very much a direct intervention into your stress response, in this case, with what we're talking about, and a direct intervention into your nervous system to create change, rather than meditation that is a little bit more exploratory, a little bit more passive as a practice, and for me serves a different purpose. But typically we just want to focus on, everyone could do with breathing slower, breathing more deeply, breathing more fully, and breathing through the nose more.
You mentioned there, obviously, panic attacks yourself, and your podcast, for anyone who hasn't listened, is fantastic. Don't judge it by the fact I was on there. There were lots of far better guests, but that's all about vulnerability. I know you've spoken very openly about this before, but I guess what got you to breath in the first place?
Yeah, panic attacks probably. So I just crossed my arms because defensive position.
Very self-aware. Yeah.
So I never know how far to start back with this question, but throughout my late teens and early 20s, I struggled with my mental health. I had challenges with primarily anxiety. That was sort of late teens, and then into my early 20s started having panic attacks. And I would say depression-like symptoms as a result of the intensity of the anxiety. I was just overwhelmed by how anxious I was, and it started interrupting and impacting my life in quite significant ways. And yeah, I was 23, 24, and I started having daily panic attacks. I was working, I started having panic attacks at work. I was just really getting to a point where it became unmanageable and a lot harder to hide. I think that was part of it as well. And I hit a particular rock bottom and a bit of a perfect storm that I've spoken a bit about in the past, where I got let go from that job a little bit unceremoniously and under strange circumstances. And I lost a friend to suicide in the space of about 3 months. And I was in the worst place I'd ever been mentally and emotionally. And started going to therapy, started opening myself up to the idea of support, and started getting back into, we talked about connecting back to things that we did when we were younger, started getting back into exercise in a way that I hadn't done for a very long time, meditation, yoga, all sorts of stuff. And I was practicing at a studio near where I lived at the time, and the head trainer there said, "Oh, why don't you stick around for breathwork after this?" I was like, "No." Never heard of it, not interested.
It's an understandable response as well.
Absolutely.
Sure. I mean,
absolutely. I hear it all the time.
I can breathe, mate. Don't worry about it.
That's the classic. I've got to. Maybe we'll come back to that. Got to a venue in Bristol for an event earlier in the year, and the security guy was like, "What are you guys here for?" Like, breathwork. He was like, "I love breathwork," and he was like in his 60s. I was like, "Really?" He was like, "Yeah, I've done it my whole life." I was like, he's done me there.
Tell me about your experience.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's amazing. Absolutely done me. And it took a little bit of time and a bit of gentle pushing. And I think I started just to open up to more things generally and go, "Oh, there's maybe a bit more to it than my closed mind might think." And then I started practicing there, and just went down the rabbit hole and got so much from it in the first probably 6 to 12 months that I saw my life really turn around in quite a big way, and in some really kind of subtle personal ways as well. And that was a combination, and it's really informed the way that I teach now, because that was a combination of all of those three parts that I've mentioned in terms of what breathwork is as well. So the sort of day-to-day aspects, the nervous system aspects, but also those deeper, sort of more transcendent, transformative experiences as well, all led to, I guess, a different experience of life for me, and me moving through that, and something that I felt like I wanted to be able to share with other people.
Do you think, obviously, like your story and how you got into it came from sort of a set of circumstances and events that happens that kind of led you into it? Do you think everyone can benefit from breathwork? I mean, just going back to what that guy said to you, obviously it's a glib, like funny response, but do you think your average working mum, or someone like that, do you think everyone can benefit from it, or do you think it's how do you think it works across the board like that?
I think there'll be people unsurprised at my answer. The simple answer is yes. And not just because this is what I do for work. I think that's important to note here, whether people want to believe that or not.
Other way around, it's probably why it's what you do for work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. The reason for that being is, I don't want to go off on a tangent about the Diary of a CEO podcast, but Stephen obviously has guests on there who like throwing out pretty wild facts and stats and research, and he had James Nestor on, who wrote a brilliant book called Breath on, I think it's The Lost Art and Science of Breathing or something like that is the subheading. Amazing book, probably the most recommended book that I've given to people on breathing and breath work. Very, very well written. In that book and on the podcast, and the kind of the trailer for the podcast that got published with Diary of a CEO was saying 99% of us have dysfunctional breathing patterns. All of us are breathing wrong. We're all going to die. And
Right about that.
yeah, and I would love to be able to sit here and go, yeah, he's absolutely right. 99% of people, absolutely. And I was chatting to some of my friends in the field, people who are much more into, I'm into the science, but people who've been in the science and sort of respiratory physiologists and people way down that end of the breathwork spectrum. And we were like, what actually are the stats? Like, can we figure this out? And a stat that got given to me by a colleague of mine was 35% of people worldwide have diagnosable dysfunctional breathing. And dysfunctional breathing is just breathing in a way that is clearly non-optimal, clearly harmful for well-being. However, probably what James Nestor is getting at, to give him cut him some slack, is that the other 65% of us, or maybe 60 of that 65%, could be breathing better, especially in the Western world. Indigenous cultures seem to have a natural ability to breathe well without needing to be told. You know, there's not breathwork coaches there's Western white breathwork coaches in Central America, but not in the indigenous cultures. And this is really where it comes back to this term optimization. It's like, you know, as a group of 3, our postures aren't terribly off, but we could probably have better posture and we probably feel better for it. Our breathing might not be terribly off, but we could be breathing better and we could feel better for it. And that, for me, is why long answer to a simple question, why I feel like everyone stands to benefit from this, especially in the way that life is set up now. Very high pace, very high stress. And breathwork is so, on the face of it, simple and so accessible, that if we could all spend if everyone could spend 10 minutes a day doing some slow box breathing or something similar, I genuinely believe that everyone would start feeling significantly better if they kept that up for a month or 2, and then onwards beyond that, just from the levels of stress, overall health, overall well-being. So yeah, I do really genuinely believe that we could, in one form or another, all benefit from breathing better and breath work in general.
The great thing about it is you can literally try it in 10 seconds and feel better, you know?
Yeah, I slightly, I don't know why it came as such a surprise to me. It was probably because I'd never kind of explored it before, but I got very kindly given a Whoop because I did an event with them. And after I got back from that event, I was pretty pretty wired. I really enjoyed it. I was buzzing, and I just got off the tube, and I could feel my heart rate going. I was like, okay, God, I'm a bit jacked up here. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get all gung-ho with my Whoop and record my heart rate live while I sit on the sofa and do 1 minute of extended exhale breathing and just see. And I might be really underwhelmed and never tell anyone about it because it might only drop by 3 beats per minute or something. And I'll be like, oh, maybe breathwork doesn't work after all. And I shocked myself. And this isn't because I do this for a living. I think this is genuinely just because of the physiology of breath. But my heart rate when I sat down was at 98 beats per minute. 1 minute later, having done probably 5 rounds of breathing in for 4 and out for 8, was at 57. Like, it had dropped like that in 60 seconds. And I was like, maybe this works after all. And it was just like this, it was a slap around the face and just a reminder of just how effective this is, but also that we don't need to overcomplicate it. I think, as you said, Hector, like, anyone can try it. If you actually give it the time of day, you will feel and see the benefits.
I guess on the other end of the spectrum, you also run breath retreats.
Yeah.
What that can, I imagine, be an incredibly profound experience. Like, what do you see at those retreats?
I teared up on a podcast the other day because I'm awful at reflecting, awful at looking back and looking at things that have happened. And I got asked a really poignant question just about retreats and started reflecting on that. And I said to myself, I was like, I think I'll look back when I'm much older and be like, Jesus Christ, that was amazing that I was able to facilitate that for people. And then I was like, why can't I do that now? And so I was just like, okay, let's take stock of this. And so on my retreats, they're sort of morphing and changing all the time, but I'll take my most recent one, which was 7 days out in Portugal in August. And they're all centered around conscious connected breathing, which is this sort of deeper healing modality of breath work that I've mentioned a couple of times. And this form of breath work really allows us to get out of our heads, into our bodies and into our subconscious mind, and really break past any protective layers and mechanisms that we've built up over our lives that have kept us safe from potentially kind of uncomfortable or difficult material that lives in the subconscious to be reprocessed in a safe way. That's probably the best way I can describe the process. And we have a session like that every single day, and then it's, I guess, encased and enclosed by complementary practices. So movement, yoga, journaling, meditation, downtime, lots of sharing circles. So lots of time together speaking about experiences, during the breathwork, speaking about life experiences. And then in Portugal, we started integrating things like anger workshops. What else did we do? Some Kundalini work, some movement work. And it's hard to put into words, what you see in people. But there was someone who came on my first ever retreat, who came on this retreat about almost exactly 12 months apart. And he is just an embodiment of the change that can happen in these spaces. And I feel really fortunate to be able to create that kind of space for people. But really it can be quite a confronting and uncomfortable week for people. I felt it on this retreat in particular, the Wednesday of the midweek, most people were ready to leave. And we were going till Saturday. I was ready to leave.
Really?
I think everyone was just like, geez, like this is brewing, because it's just like you're dredging up things. You're shaking that jar of muddy water to really explore, who are you, what's led you here, what's blocking you, where are you getting in your own way, and how can you get out of your own way? And if you're not prepared to ask those questions, that's uncomfortable. Even if you are prepared to ask those questions, that's uncomfortable. And it's like deep, dark, dirty, scrubbing beneath the surface. But there's always a lightness and a freedom and a liberation that comes out the other side of that. It's a deep exercise in self-awareness and introspection. And if you can sit with some of that discomfort and explore some of those parts of yourself that you have locked away, then that to me is I don't like the word healing as much as I used to, because I think it carries with it a bit of whatever stigma and cliche. But that's to me what healing is actually reintegrating parts of ourselves that we've lost touch with and rejected and pushed away. And I think in order to do that, we have to dig back into the depths of the discomfort and the stuff that maybe we've ignored over the years. And breathwork is a very powerful, I guess, vehicle with which to do that. And then everything else really is there to help hold it together and help people process and integrate the things that do show up.
It's crazy as well. You said, was it 20,000 breaths a day? Yeah. So there's nothing you do more than breathe, I suppose. And I actually have the Whoop as well. I've kind of fallen out of love with it, to be honest. But because it's just another thing to look at on the phone. But one thing I didn't know, and why would you know this, is how many times you breathe per minute. So it says I'm like 16 or something, but it should be way less, right? In an optimal, if everything was optimal, you should be breathing is this right, 6 or 7 breaths a minute, something like that? Or do you think that's just
It'll fluctuate over the course of the day anyway. So to come back to what we were saying about the nervous system, your breathing will come up and down depending on where your level of activation is over the course of the day. We'll all probably here be at the upper end of the teens because we're chatting and we're active and we're kind of focused. At rest, you want to sit, or the average sits somewhere between 12 and 20. So that's the general average spectrum. You'd like to think that at rest, most people would be sitting 10 to 12, would be, I would say, a nice place to be. Very seasoned practitioners, monks, they've seen monks in deep meditation get down to 1 to 2 breaths per minute, almost to the point where they're not breathing. And it's a really nice measure of where you're at. Not necessarily to compare to the monks or to compare to the seasoned practitioners, but to say, okay, if the Whoop's telling me 16, if I can go into a practice and get myself to 6 or 7, my body and my mind will respond to that in a positive way to calm me down and to find a little bit more space and a little bit more stillness. And then a lot of the stuff that we've talked around about optimizing how you breathe day to day will naturally bring that down. And so, I also get a little bit tired of wearables as well, but I think the data can be helpful to see those trends as long as we're not then stressing about the trends. But yeah, the lower the better is typically what we're saying here and what we're talking about, but it will naturally fluctuate through the day as well.
And sorry, you go.
Yeah, in terms of the podcast, I mean, you did three or four seasons of that. I mean, you obviously went into that with the personal experiences you spoke about earlier, but what surprised you? What did you learn? Because I mean, you really had some very vulnerable conversations in there.
Yeah, I look back on that as probably one of my greatest teachers in terms of the lessons I learned for myself. I think I underestimated or misunderstood at the time how much of a therapeutic process it was for me, and how little I knew when I started out. I think I went into it going, I'm ready for this, and are we ever ready for anything? But even listening back now, I wouldn't necessarily. I'm a different person, and like my views. I'm not a different person. My views have transformed and changed over time as well, and I can hear the learning sort of through the conversations. I think some of the biggest learnings and takeaways for me were. I think we often hear, men need to talk more, men need to be having these conversations more, and I think I was surprised at just how many men were having these conversations, or were certainly willing to have these conversations. But probably my biggest takeaway personally about myself and about the people I spoke to was just how lacking in modeling we were for emotional conversations, emotional language, and how much better we need to do for everyone and men going forward is actually how can we teach men to accept themselves as they are, but also learn to do better and have more skills, learn the skills that it takes to have open, vulnerable conversations, and do so in a way that doesn't leave them feeling, and again, it's a word that carries sort of a loaded word, but doesn't leave them feeling weak. It doesn't leave them feeling emasculated. It doesn't leave them, and that's kind of a collective thing that we need to work on. Is actually one thing. I got interviewed about this quite recently, and they were like, "What? How have your views changed around men's mental health?" And I think for me, I did a bit of a job of throwing the baby out with the bathwater with masculinity. I was like, "Well, there's a lot of things about it I don't like. A lot of things I can see that harmed me and my upbringing. So let's get rid of all of it. Let's get rid of any kind of notion of traditional masculinity, and let's start from scratch." And actually, I think there's nothing wrong with a large majority of what we might call traditional masculinity. It's just there are holes, as with everything. There are blind spots, there are weak spots, and there are things that we need to do better. And it's just, I guess, the original message behind the podcast was that vulnerability and strength not only can coexist, but necessitate one another. Vulnerability is strength, and strength comes through vulnerability.
It's amazing how people reciprocate vulnerability. So, I mean, I started seeing a psychosexual therapist who I heard on your podcast.
Yes, she's brilliant.
And that was something I think relationships had already been a challenge for me up until that point. And then just going through that process of, being able to understand myself better there and then share it afterwards, which I have done since on various podcasts like that. It's just amazing how people reciprocate. There are people who, for years, my conversations with them have been very not open. And then you mention this one thing and people have all these stories to share, and you really get a kind of deep look into someone. So I think it's one of those where just by being vulnerable, you'd be amazed what you can open up, which I think your podcast was testament to.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you're spot on. I've noticed it as well in my friends. I think people I've known for 20 plus years, and we're at the pub, the traditional arena for a couple of pints and a deep conversation, and you're having these really just never been had before conversations with these people that I've known for such a long time. And it does come from that place of I believe we all want to have these conversations, but we're all waiting for someone else to speak first. And it just takes not even courage, some people might say courage, but I just think a willing and a level of self-awareness to be able to have that conversation, or at least open that conversation in a way that isn't saying, I know right and you're wrong, but just say, okay, this is where I'm at. Like, this is my experience. What's your experience? And then it just creates such an amazing container for connection. And to come back to the retreats, that's such a big part of, probably the most impactful part of the retreats is the sharing circles and the conversations, because it's this, you go from 15 strangers to people who are closer to these people after a week than they are to some of their closest friends, because they've been allowed to have conversations that they've wanted to have for a very long time but haven't known how to. And I think I view it as a good thing and a bad thing, a bit of a shame ultimately that we have to create spaces for us to have those conversations. So I'm like, why are we not having those anyway? Or why is it hard for us to have those?
Taxi drivers are always my
Yeah.
I'm not sitting around in a circle of 15, but it's incredible what you'll tell a taxi driver as opposed to like intimate members of your friends and families. I don't know where that comes from, but yeah,
I think there's a solace in strangers. I do. Podcast, as a guest on podcasts, I always find myself, divulging more easily. But I think it's about creating, and maybe it's nothing to do with podcasts, it's to do with the format and the structure, which is actually intentionally creating space for a conversation rather than round a golf and a half chat about how's your family, how's the missus, how's work. It's actually going, okay, we're here to talk about bigger questions and actually just sit here and make eye contact and have a conversation. And I think that's somewhat lacking, and something that we take for granted. We're like, oh, well, I'm mates with that person, so that'll just happen. And if that does happen for you, then that's great. And it's a real sign of positivity around your friendships. But actually, I think for a lot of us, with family, with friends, with even our partners, there needs to be a step of intentionality. If you want depth, create space for it and create a way for that to happen, because it's not just going to happen by accident.
Yeah, there's something very British about it, isn't it? About the kind of dancing around anything but the one thing that matters.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's when you do get stuff off your chest or have a really actually deep conversation with someone, you realize just how much we carry around all day. Like you spoke earlier about locking stuff up. Like, we all have so much locked up, and obviously, a lot of the work you do and meditation, everything else helps people slowly take down these barriers. But I think most of us are just kind of soldiering on with all the traumas, all the worries, all the concerns, and actually every little piece of that you can share and offload and take off your plate, you feel a little bit lighter. So it's definitely an amazing thing to do.
Yeah,
I think as well, like, you don't want to be seen to be like whining. But like, do you know what I mean? Because that is annoying. Yeah. Like if you meet someone straight away and you haven't seen them for a while and they're like, oh, my boss, and they start complaining and whining, you're just like, I didn't ask for that. Do you know what I mean? Like, of course, I'll listen to like really good friends and family and stuff and people that want to open up, but I'm just constantly, I don't like it when people like complain or are negative about trivial stuff or even like medium-sized stuff. So I just always catch myself and do it. I'm like, no one wants to hear you whine or complain or anything like that.
There's almost something about it, and I also don't like it, and also can't put my finger on what exactly it is. But there's something about it where it is a bit superficial in a way, and it doesn't get to the like, but how are you really? It's like here's everything that was wrong today, but it's not the inside, like what's really going on with you.
It's the second layer, right? Because it's like, this person said this to me and it made me feel like this. The real question there is, and this is where I think people can get a bit sick of this kind of chat in a way, and I'm very aware of that, but it's like, the real question there is, what wound are they prodding? What is it that's made you made you feel a way, but actually what's that highlighted in you that you're now feeling about yourself? Have they made you feel like you're not good enough? Have they made you feel like you're rejected? Like, what is the underlying feeling and how is that playing out for you? Because I think you're right, like, we hear the top level, high level, complaints about the day, complaints about person at work, complaints about the tube, but it's like, well, what's the next layer beneath that? And I think one thing that I've seen, and probably a development since I first had the podcast, is, I think, let's take men as the example, right? It's like, the narrative is we've been unable to talk about our emotions, there's not been space for it, we don't know how to do it, we're very closed off. And when we start unpacking that and healing that, it's like this pendulum, and we go from one end to the other. We go, okay, well, we're just going to share everything. You've told us to talk about our emotions, so now we're talking about our emotions, whether you like it or not. And we're just dumping. Exactly. It's like, but this is where it's a skill and like a balancing act, because actually it's emotional vulnerability and openness, but what we're actually seeking in everybody is emotional regulation. It's going, okay, I'm not just saying offload all your problems all the time, because actually we need to have some level of productivity to life and to looking forward and to carrying on, because you can't just mope, because that it's not good for anybody. It's not good for yourself. It's not good for people around you. So how can you know, I always, relationships are the easiest container for this, right? And it's going, okay, I know, and I say I don't always get this right. I'd probably go as far as to say I probably get this right 50% of the time if I'm lucky. With my girlfriend, I was like, the thing for me, I might be feeling something really uncomfortable, really heavy, anxious, whatever it might be. And rather than going, I need to talk to you about this now, sit down. It's actually going, there's something that I'm feeling quite uncomfortable about right now. Do you have capacity to have a conversation about this? And that actually gives someone the space. And it takes regulation in return, because as a partner, you might just go, yeah, of course, what's wrong? Even if you're not sure if you can hold that kind of conversation right now. But it does give that person the responsibility and the opportunity to say, I am really busy. I've got loads on my plate. I'm actually feeling a bit knackered myself. I'd love to come back to this later on today when I do feel like I've got a bit more space for that. And I think that's the missing piece in a lot of life, is actually don't just offload and dump everything that's inside your head. Like, learn to communicate effectively. So it's like, don't just keep it to yourself and lock it all away. Don't just offload it. Find a middle ground where it's saying, there's another part to this conversation, I guess, which is, what of this can I self-regulate? What of this can I unpack and sort of look into myself and say, okay, that was really uncomfortable, but I've sat with it for half an hour and actually I don't need to talk about it anymore. I've journaled about it, or I've meditated, or I've just let it go, or I've spoken to a friend about it, whatever it might be. Maybe you get half an hour later and you go, yeah, this hasn't gone away. I really feel like this is something I need to talk about. Then can I approach, in this example, my partner and say, I'd like to talk to you about something. When's a good time for you? Or when do you feel like you have capacity for that? And I think that can apply to friendships, to work, to whatever it might be. Actually going, this idea of self-regulation and co-regulation, it's like, what can I hold on my own without repressing it, without pushing it down, without locking it away and ignoring it? But also, what can go into conversation with somebody else, and in what form? Like, how do I actually, taking time to not just be reactive in what you're sharing and shoving it down people's throats, actually going, what needs to be shared and how do I want to share it? Can I come to this conversation in a productive way for me and for the other person? So I think there's some emotional regulation skills and communication skills that, as a collective, we can all do a little bit better on.
Just finally, kind of circling back to breathwork and your work. What do you think the future is for breathwork? Obviously, there's a massive appetite for everything to do with health and wellness. Breathing, something that, bar something extraordinary, we're going to be doing as humans for the next, as long as we're on the planet. So, do you think it becomes more popular? Do you think it just becomes something that maybe the majority of the population are taught at a younger age and master, and then they take that forward into adulthood? Or how do you think it goes?
It's going to be interesting. I think we're probably getting, say if there's a bubble, we're probably at 70% capacity of the bubble. It's really exponential at the moment in terms of the interest, in terms of practitioners coming into the space, everyone's excitement around it. I would love, I think probably one of the most fundamental pieces of the future of this, if it goes in the right direction, would be schools, young people, getting things that we all know need to be in schools, into schools: emotional regulation, stress management, breathing better, feeling better, all of that stuff that creates happy, healthy people. That's, I guess, piece one. I think for the broader population, that would be an amazing thing. But I think in the shorter term, while we're working away on that side of things, I think there will come a point where most people will become aware of the link between breath and emotion, breath and stress, and go, okay, I get the basics. And it sort of harps back to what we were told as kids, if you're feeling a bit panicky, take a deep breath. Like that's been around for eons, but no one knew why. No one was doing it quite right. We all were slightly off the mark. And so it's actually like, okay, give your kids, my partner's daughter came home from school the other day. She's just turned 6 and she came home with some colouring to do, and up the top it said rainbow breathing, and they had to colour in the rainbow and breathe in on the way around and breathe out the other way around.
Love that.
And so it's starting to get there, and I was like, my girlfriend sent me a picture of it, and I was like, it's beginning.
That's a long way from how volcanoes formed and all the other nonsense.
Exactly.
Love that.
And so that's where we start to see real progress, I think, is actually if you get a generation where they know that if they're feeling a bit wound up and a bit frustrated, they just need to take a few deep breaths and know how to do it, then that to me is a big shift. But I do think, this stuff in all its forms has probably been around in the Western world since the 60s en masse. And so I don't see it going anywhere anytime soon. And I think the deeper end, like the retreats and the altered states of consciousness, that to me is always going to be of interest to people, because there's always stuff to uncover and learn about yourself and to go inwards and things like that. So I think we might get to a base level of understanding on how to breathe well to be healthy and to feel less stressed. And then there'll be other avenues and, new things are always popping up. So I think it's going to be certainly an interesting few years as things continue to ramp up. But then I do think we'll see a bit of a leveling out and a bit more of just an acceptance en masse that we know that this is helpful. You guys don't need to keep harping on about how helpful it is. We get it now, so let's just do it. And I think that would be a really good place to get to as well.
Love it, Mel. I feel so calm after listening to your voice for 45 minutes. So.
It's a podcast voice for sure. Right, well, there we are.
Spot on.
Just shy of an hour. So thanks a lot, Jamie. And just let everyone know where they can find you, where the best place is, and the kind of services you offer.
Absolutely. Well, for as long as Instagram exists, you can find me on Instagram at _breath_space, thebreathspace.co.uk, YouTube. I've got some stuff on Insight Timer as well. The podcast was called Man Down. The new one will be called The Boys' Toilets. And that's pretty much it.
And maybe some CDs and unplugged cabins.
Yes.
Great stuff. And Jamie's website is beautiful. So check
Well done, is it?
Great stuff.
Awesome.
Great stuff.